The stagecoach rattled over the unforgiving plains of Dust Creek, New Mexico, the sound of creaking wood and clattering wheels breaking the silence of the wide-open land. Inside, Ella sat, gripping the letter with trembling hands. It was worn from constant handling, edges frayed by the long journey it had taken her on. The weight of her past pressed down on her chest, but this letter, the promise it carried, had been her only hope. My name is Jed Carter. I live west of Dust Creek on a small ranch. My wife passed. I have a daughter, 3 years old. I need a woman to raise her. You will be safe here. I offer no promises, but peace. Peace. A word that had sounded so comforting when she first read it. The promise of a new life, far from the troubles she had left behind. It had come just when she had lost everything, her mother, her home, her dignity. This letter was her lifeline, a fresh start in a world that had never given her a chance. But as the stagecoach slowed and the dry, dusty land of Dust Creek came into view, the hope that had once burned bright began to flicker. The town wasn't much more than a collection of run-down houses and sagging fences. Dust swirled in the wind, settling over everything it touched, giving the place a sense of abandonment. Ella stared out the window, heart pounding, wondering if she had made the right decision. When the coach finally stopped, she stepped out onto the gravel road, her boots crunching beneath her. The air was dry and cool, and the land stretched out in every direction like a vast, empty ocean. Ella tightened her grip on the small canvas bag she carried. It was all she had left. No family, no friends, just this letter and the hope that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new here. The house ahead of her was small, weathered by time and surrounded by the harsh emptiness of the land. No one was waiting for her. No welcoming smiles, no open arms. The town felt lifeless, as though even the earth had forgotten it. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of her decision settling over her, like the thick dust in the air. She had come here expecting peace, but all she found was more silence. The door creaked open as she approached, and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in worn ranch clothes. His face was hard, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply stood there, silent, watching her. This was Jed Carter, the man who had promised her peace. But as Ella stood before him, she realized she didn't know what to expect. What kind of man was he? What had she walked into? The silent cowboy, an unspoken invitation. Ella hesitated as she approached the man standing before her. His presence was like the land, silent, unyielding, and a little intimidating. There was something in his eyes, something she couldn't read. Was it suspicion, fear, or something else entirely? She had hoped for kindness, for the chance to start over, but all she saw was a man whose face seemed to carry the weight of too many unspoken words. "Are you Jed?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended, her heart beating faster. Jed didn't answer. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't understand. He tapped his chest, then made a slicing motion across his throat. Ella frowned, confused. He wasn't speaking, and his gestures didn't make sense to her. I don't understand," she murmured, glancing at the small house, then back at him. Jed didn't speak. He only nodded, confirming her confusion. There was something about his silence that made the air feel heavier, like the weight of 1,000 untold stories hung between them. Just as she was about to ask again, the door to the house opened and a small voice called out, "Mama!" Ella turned quickly. Standing in the doorway was a little girl, no older than 3, with blonde curls tangled from sleep. She was wearing a nightgown too big for her small frame, and as she rubbed her eyes with one fist, she looked up at Ella. "Mama?" the little girl repeated, her voice soft and unsure. Ella froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The word "mama" pierced through her like a blade. She hadn't expected this. The letter had promised peace, but she hadn't expected to walk into a family. She hadn't expected to be a mother, even in name. Before she could react, a burst of laughter echoed from behind her, and when she turned, she saw several young men on horseback, perched on a ridge above the house. Their laughter was loud, mocking, and cruel. "Well, look who showed up," one of them called. "She really thought she was coming to some wedding, didn't she?" The other riders laughed, taunting her with every word. "Look at her. She's not even good enough for the joke." The laughter stung, and for a moment, Ella felt the weight of it all. The hope, the disappointment, the realization that she had walked into a cruel joke. She felt small and foolish, exposed and vulnerable, like a pawn in someone else's game. And Jed, he stood there, silent. His face was unreadable, and the weight of his quiet presence felt like a judgment she couldn't escape. The joke, a public humiliation. The riders' laughter cut through the air like a knife. Ella stood frozen, her heart racing as they mocked her. "Look at her," one of them sneered. "Thought she was coming here for some happy life." Guess she didn't get the joke. They were laughing at her for being foolish enough to believe in the promise of a new life. Laughing at her for walking into a situation where she wasn't wanted, where she was nothing but the punchline of a cruel joke. She stood there, exposed, feeling every word like a slap to the face. This wasn't what she had imagined. This wasn't the safety, the peace she had hoped for. This was a humiliation, a public mockery that left her feeling small, insignificant, and worthless. The wind howled around her, carrying the laughter of the riders with it, and for a moment she wanted to run, to escape, to leave this place behind and never look back. But she didn't move. Instead, she looked at Jed. She wanted him to speak. She wanted him to defend her, to say something, anything, to stop this madness. But he didn't. He stood there as silent as ever, his expression unreadable. The emptiness of his silence felt like betrayal. And then, just as she was about to give up, something unexpected happened. Jed stepped forward, moving with purpose. Without a word, he reached up and removed his coat, the fabric worn and faded with years of use. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her at all. But with quiet determination, he draped the coat over her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but it spoke volumes. The coat was warm, its scent of wood smoke and leather filling her senses. And for a moment she felt a strange sense of comfort, as if someone, he, had acknowledged her, if only for a second. The unexpected gesture, a coat in the wind. Ella stood still, the weight of Jed's coat settling over her shoulders like a shield. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even kindness in the way she had hoped for. But it was something small, something real. In a world that had mocked her, in a place that had offered nothing but cruelty, this was the first sign that perhaps she wasn't completely alone. She didn't say anything. She couldn't. Words didn't seem enough to express the strange mix of emotions that flooded her. The laughter from the men still echoed in the distance, but it felt farther away now, less important. The wind wasn't as harsh. The world didn't feel as cold. Jed didn't speak, didn't give her any words of comfort, but in this simple act of placing his coat over her shoulders, he had given her something she hadn't expected, a moment of quiet protection. He turned and walked back toward the house without a glance, leaving her to stand there, the coat still warm on her shoulders. Ella blinked, swallowing back the lump in her throat. For the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something real. Not a fairy tale, not an easy life, but something solid. Something that was built from small, quiet gestures that spoke louder than words ever could. The unspoken understanding, building trust. As the days passed, Ella fell into the rhythm of ranch life. It wasn't easy, nothing about it was. The mornings were long, the tasks were grueling, and the heat of the day seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the sun itself was determined to test her endurance. But something changed. She began to feel the weight of the land less, its harshness becoming a part of her, rather than something she was fighting against. Each day she woke early, just before dawn, when the first light of day broke through the horizon. The house creaked as it settled with the cold night air, and the smell of wood smoke from the small stove filled the space, warming it as she prepared breakfast. The work was exhausting, but she found satisfaction in it. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, and mended the old clothes she found in the attic. There were always little things to do, tasks that needed doing, and in a way they gave her purpose. Jed, as always, remained quiet. He was a constant presence, his silent strength seeming to infuse every part of the ranch. He worked alongside her, mending fences and fixing the barn, always moving with purpose. His silence wasn't cold or unkind, it was simply him. He didn't need to speak to let her know he was there, that he was helping, that he was making sure things were being done. It was in the small acts, the way he would silently take the heavy buckets from her hands or carry the firewood without needing to be asked. His eyes would flicker toward her now and then, but he never said much, just the occasional nod or grunt of acknowledgement. And somehow, that was enough. Ella had expected to feel isolated, to be trapped in her own thoughts in this place, but with Jed's silent presence, it wasn't so bad. There was no need for constant conversation. Over time, she began to understand the rhythm of his silence. It was a part of who he was, something born from years of pain and loss. But in his quiet way, he had opened a door for her to step through. He didn't need to speak to her. He showed her in the way he moved, in the way he helped her with the most mundane tasks. One morning, after Ella had finished cleaning the barn, she noticed Jed standing by the porch, looking out over the fields. His face was turned toward the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to rise, casting the world in golden light. She hesitated for a moment before walking up to him, feeling the weight of the silence between them. "You know," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the wind, "I'm not used to this. The silence, but it feels different here. It's not as heavy as I thought it would be." Jed didn't respond, but his eyes flickered toward her for a moment, and that was enough. She didn't need a long speech, didn't need him to explain his life. She understood that this was his way of communicating. She had learned to speak the language of silence, and in return, she had begun to feel understood. The past unfolds, a secret revealed. It was during one of the rare, quiet moments in the evening that Ella decided to explore the attic. There was a chill in the air, the first hint of autumn creeping in, and she had noticed a few blankets that could use mending. When she climbed up into the attic, the dust in the air tickled her throat, but it was the quiet that intrigued her most. This part of the house was full of forgotten things, the remnants of a life lived before hers. As her eyes scanned the dim light of the attic, she noticed a small bundle tucked away in the corner, almost as if it had been placed there intentionally. Curious, she reached for it, carefully unwrapping the cloth that covered it. Inside, she found a drawing, a charcoal sketch of a man, a woman, and a child. The woman, with long, dark hair and piercing eyes, was unmistakably Comanche, and the child, no older than 3, had blonde curls that mirrored Annie's. The man was Jed, though he was younger in the drawing, his face softer, less weathered. The woman in the drawing held the child in her arms, and it was clear from their expressions that they were a family, Jed's family. Ella's breath caught in her chest as she examined the sketch. The woman in the drawing wasn't her. She was someone else, someone Jed had loved. Her heart ached as the reality of the situation began to sink in. She wasn't here to replace this woman. She could never be her. The quiet weight of the discovery pressed down on Ella as she sat on the attic floor, the drawing clutched in her hands. Jed's wife, This woman who had been torn from him by the town's cruelty had been the love of his life. The story of her death, of how she had been hanged for simply loving Jed, flooded Ella's mind. She understood now why Jed was so silent, why he didn't speak. His silence was born of grief, of loss, of a wound that had never healed. Ella looked at the picture again, her fingers tracing the lines of the sketch. It was a quiet love, a love that had been cruelly torn apart. And here she was, trying to be something she wasn't. She wasn't the woman in the picture, and she would never be able to take that place. But she didn't have to. She didn't know if she could ever heal the wounds that Jed had carried with him all these years. But she knew one thing. She wasn't going to leave. Not now. Not after everything she had seen, everything she had felt. She wasn't his replacement. She was something new, a new possibility, the neighbor, a bitter truth. A few days later, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, Tom, the old neighbor, stopped by to trade eggs and some dried herbs. Ella had seen him a few times before, but this time, as he leaned on the fence, he looked at her with a knowing expression, his eyes heavy with the burden of unspoken things. "You found the drawing, didn't you?" Tom asked, his voice low, as if he was trying to gauge her reaction. Ella felt her throat tighten. She hadn't told anyone about the drawing, and yet here he was, asking about it like it was an open secret. She nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. Tom sighed deeply, his gaze flickering toward the house. "You ought to know," he began, his voice heavy with the years of regret. "Jed's wife, she was a good woman. A Comanche woman. The town never accepted her. They didn't accept Jed either. They hated him for loving her." Ella's chest tightened. She could feel the sadness in his voice, the weight of the years that had shaped the town's opinions. Tom's words were like a bitter truth, a reminder of how love had been torn apart by prejudice and hate. "They hanged her, you know," Tom continued, "right behind the church. And Jed, well, he tried to stop it, tried to save her. But they broke him. That's why he doesn't speak. The town didn't just kill her, they killed him too." Ella's heart shattered. She had known about the rumors, about the death of Jed's wife. But hearing it from Tom, hearing the sorrow in his voice, made it real. She had thought Jed's silence was just part of who he was. But now she understood. His silence wasn't just a part of his nature. It was a result of pain, of betrayal, of a loss that no one in this town had ever truly understood. Ella stood silently, absorbing Tom's words. She felt a deep sympathy for Jed, but she also understood something else. This town, this land had taken so much from him, and now it was taking her too. She wasn't just the outsider, she was a part of this story, a part of the healing Jed had started so many years ago. The breaking point, defending what's hers. The next morning, just as the sun began to rise over the mountains, 3 riders appeared at the ranch gate. Ella heard them long before she saw them, their loud voices carrying across the open space. They were the same men who had taunted her when she arrived, the same ones who had mocked her for thinking she could find a home here. She gripped the shotgun in her hands, her fingers tightening around the cold metal. She wasn't going to stand there and let them hurt her anymore. She wasn't going to let them mock her, her family, and the life she was beginning to build. "Get off my land," Ella called out, her voice steady and unwavering. The riders froze, their mocking laughter silenced by the sound of the shotgun cocking. "Don't come any closer," she warned, her voice sharp with authority. Jed appeared beside her, silent as always. His presence was enough. He didn't need to speak. His standing next to her said everything that needed to be said. The riders hesitated, their confidence faltering in the face of Ella's unflinching resolve. One of them, the boldest, made a move toward her, but before he could say another word, Jed stepped forward. The riders paused, and for a moment, the world stood still. One of the men reached for his gun, but before he could pull it out, The second rider threw a glass bottle at Jed, striking him across the shoulder. The bottle shattered with a sickening crack. Ella's heart stopped. She rushed to Jed's side, her hands shaking as she checked his wound. He didn't cry out, didn't speak. His face was pale, but his body remained strong, unmoving. "Jed!" she cried, panic creeping into her voice. He nodded once, his hand holding her back, as if to assure her he was okay. The riders had seen the warning in her eyes, and they didn't press their luck. After a few tense moments, the men turned and rode off, muttering under their breath as they left. The land fell silent again. Ella lowered the shotgun slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned back to Jed, her heart heavy with worry. But he was already standing tall again, his eyes meeting hers. He had stepped in front of her to protect her, just like the silent, steady man he was. The wound, a silent cry for help. The rush of adrenaline from the confrontation quickly faded, leaving a hollow sense of fear and urgency. As the last of the riders disappeared over the horizon, Ella turned back to Jed, who was now standing at the center of the porch, his face pale. Blood seeped slowly through the fabric of his shirt, staining it dark. His strong, silent exterior didn't change, but Ella could see the toll it had taken on him. His jaw was clenched, his posture stiff, but his hand instinctively reached for his shoulder where the bottle had struck. "Jed," she breathed, her heart thundering in her chest. She could feel the sharp sting of panic rise in her throat as she stepped forward, but he only raised his hand, gesturing for her to hold on. The man had never shown fear, but in that moment she saw it in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability he rarely allowed himself. "I'm fine," he mouthed, the words coming slowly and painfully, his throat tight from the effort. Ella's breath caught. She had never seen him this way. Even in his worst moments, he had always remained composed, a figure of stoic resilience. Yet here, in front of her, the harsh reality of the wound he bore was impossible to ignore. She didn't know if it was the injury or the weight of everything else, the grief, the violence he had endured, that was starting to break him down, but she couldn't let him shut her out. "No, you're not," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're hurt. You can't keep pushing through this alone." He looked at her, his eyes softening slightly. She could see the inner conflict playing out in the depths of his gaze, the struggle between allowing himself to lean on her and his need to remain the silent protector. "I'll be all right," he scribbled on the notepad he always kept tucked in his pocket. He held it out to her, the words simple. "I can take care of this." But Ella didn't take the note. Instead, she gently placed a hand on his chest, the warmth of his body under her palm reassuring in its steadiness. "You're not alone in this, Jed. I'm here." He didn't respond, but the slight nod he gave her was more than enough. It was as if, for the first time, he was beginning to allow her in, to see that he didn't have to bear all the pain alone. With the urgency that only true concern could bring, Ella rushed to gather the supplies to tend to his injury. She led him inside, her voice soft but firm. "You can't keep doing this. You can't keep carrying everything by yourself." As she cleaned the wound, his silence was as constant as ever, but it no longer felt cold or distant. It was now a space where they could be together, in the quiet, without needing to explain every emotion. She worked with steady hands, trying to ease the pain of his injury, but it was more than just the physical wound she was tending to. It was the quiet cry for help he had never let anyone hear. As she finished wrapping the bandage, she looked up at him. His expression remained unchanged, but she saw something flicker in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Maybe it was the weight of his vulnerability finally showing, or maybe it was the quiet acceptance that he didn't have to fight alone anymore. The air was still heavy with everything unsaid between them, But in that silence, they had found a shared understanding. Ella wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't leaving him to fight his battles alone. And for the first time in years, Jed let that truth settle in his bones. The home they've built, a new beginning, days passed, and the rhythm of ranch life continued. But there was a subtle change in the air. Ella had expected things to remain the same, rough, hard, and filled with the struggle of surviving on land that seemed to care little for the people who tried to tame it. But as the seasons shifted, something unexpected began to happen. The ranch, once cold and unwelcoming, started to feel like home. The mornings were still long, the tasks never-ending, but with every chore completed, with every meal shared, Ella began to find a sense of peace she hadn't known she was missing. The isolation she had felt when she first arrived seemed to dissipate, replaced by the quiet companionship she shared with Jed. They still didn't speak much, but the absence of words no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a bond, one built on understanding and shared purpose. Annie, too, had become a part of Ella's life, in a way she hadn't expected. The little girl had warmed to her presence, and each night after dinner, Ella would read stories to her, the words coming to life as she spoke them aloud. Stories about bravery, adventure, and love, stories Ella had once read to her own mother. As the weeks passed, Annie's smile grew brighter, and the warmth in the house seemed to mirror the warmth that was slowly growing between her and Jed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Ella sat on the porch, wrapped in the quilt Jed had given her. She didn't feel like an outsider anymore. She didn't feel like the woman who had been sold and abandoned. She felt like she was part of something real, something she had built with her own hands, and with Jed's quiet support. Jed joined her, standing just inside the doorframe, his silhouette framed by the fading light. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The bond between them had been formed not through words, but through shared experience. They had both faced loss, both suffered in silence, but together they had started to heal. The house, once cold and empty, now felt alive with the rhythm of their lives. Each day a new step toward something better. Annie ran across the yard, her laughter ringing through the air as she tossed a snowball into the air, watching it fall back down with wide-eyed delight. For a moment, Ella forgot about the hardships of their lives. She watched the girl play, watched Jed as he stood beside her, his arm resting lightly on her shoulder. This was their life now, a life of quiet moments and simple joys. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and for the first time since she had arrived in Dust Creek, Ella felt like she had found where she belonged. As the snow began to fall, the family stood together, no longer broken, no longer lost. They were a family in their own way, and the future no longer felt as uncertain as it once had. "Looks like we're keeping this one," Ella murmured, looking up at Jed as he stood beside her. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Yeah," he wrote on the notepad, "I think so." And in that moment, Ella knew they had finally built something real, a home.